The execution of Teresa Lewis has been carried out in the manner as prescribed by the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Convicted murderer Teresa Lewis became the first woman in 5 years to be executed in the U.S. Thursday night, and the first woman in almost a century to be put to death in Virginia.
She looked a little startled when she walked in. She sort of looked around. It was a fearful expression. 2 guards led her in through either elbow, led her to the gurney.
The 41-year-old Lewis died by injection, convicted of arranging the murders of her husband and stepson in October of 2002. Prosecutors say she hired 2 men, offering them sex and money to carry out the job so she could collect the $250,000 insurance payout. Lewis pleaded guilty in 2003. Her supporters argued that her IQ was barely above what the state classifies as mentally challenged, and that alone should have disqualified Lewis from the death penalty. But Wednesday, Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell denied her clemency request, and the Supreme Court refused to intervene. The triggermen Lewis hired both received sentences of life in prison, and one of them committed suicide in 2006. Brian Thomas, The Associated Press.
Teresa Lewis, the woman with a 72 IQ who killed her husband and stepson for $250,000. Her planned crime was shockingly simple: the nature of justice and manipulation forever. On one fateful night, Teresa Lewis turned her own home into a slaughterhouse, wiping out the family she had once sworn to love. Today, we go back to September 23, 2010, after nearly 8 years on death row in Virginia, when Teresa Lewis, the only woman on death row at the time, would face the lethal injection. From a poor woman pushed around by life to the mastermind of a brutal double murder, we will explore her last meal, her final words to the victim's daughter, and the secret of who was truly behind it all, a secret that one of the accomplices took to his grave. The following content contains elements of real violence and crime. Viewer discretion is advised. On a cold autumn night in October 2002, in the quiet countryside of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, a 911 call shattered the silence. The voice of a woman, Teresa Lewis, frantically reported a home invasion and a brutal attack. When the police arrived, they were confronted with a horrific scene. Julian Lewis, the husband, was dying on the floor with multiple gunshot wounds, and his son, Charles J. Lewis, a 25-year-old Army reservist, was dead in his bedroom. Initially, it looked like a tragic robbery murder. But a small detail, a whisper from the dying husband, changed the entire course of the investigation, turning the weeping wife into the prime suspect. Teresa's IQ of 72 would become the center of a legal debate that lasted nearly a decade. This detail will be crucial later in the story because it raises a core question: could a person with such limited cognitive ability truly be the head of the snake? Or was she just a pawn in a more sinister game? And remember the name Matthew Schallenberger, a 21-year-old with an IQ of 113. He was not only one of the 2 gunmen, but also the key to unlocking the complex psychology behind the crime. His relationship with Teresa was not just sexual, it was a deadly combination of dependency and manipulation. Who do you think was the real mastermind, Teresa Lewis with an IQ bordering on intellectual disability, or Matthew Schallenberger, the smarter but calculating young man? Comment below. To understand what pushed a woman to this precipice, we need to go back in time to look at the parallel lives of the perpetrator and her victims' lives that intersected at a fateful point and ended in tragedy. In one timeline, we have Julian Clifton, Lewis Jr., a hard-working man, a supervisor at the Dan River Textile Mill. He was a widowed father trying to raise his 3 children alone after the death of his first wife. His life was a series of hard work days and tireless efforts to rebuild a complete home. His youngest son, Charles J. Lewis, was the pride of the family, a young, healthy man who had joined the United States Army Reserve, ready to be deployed to Iraq to serve his country. Charles embodied the future hope and responsibility. The lives of Julian and Charles were an idyllic picture of family affection and hard work in rural Virginia. They were good people living an honest life. Parallel to that in another timeline was the life of Teresa Wilson. Born into poverty in Danville, Virginia, Teresa's childhood was tied to the textile mills where both her parents toiled. She dropped out of school at 16 to get married, but the marriage quickly fell apart, leaving her with a daughter, Christy, and loneliness. Teresa sank into alcohol and painkillers, drifting through dozens of low-wage jobs, always feeling unstable, as her former mother-in-law described her. Her life was a series of bad choices and deprivation, both material and emotional. These two timelines intersected in the spring of 2000 at the very Dan River textile mill, where Julian was a supervisor and Teresa was a worker. The empathy of a widower met the fragility of a woman seeking support. Just a few months later, in June 2000, Teresa and her 16-year-old daughter moved in with Julian. They soon married. It seemed as if Teresa had found a peaceful haven. But then the first tragedy struck. In December 2001, Jason, Julian's eldest son, was killed in a car accident. The pain of losing a son was somewhat eased by a $200,000 life insurance payout. Julian used the money to buy a house and a 5-acre plot of land, building a new home. But it was at this moment that a seed of greed was sown in the soil of tragedy. In August 2002, Charles, before preparing to deploy to Iraq, purchased a life insurance policy worth $250,000. He named his father, Julian, as the primary beneficiary and his stepmother, Teresa Lewis, as the secondary beneficiary. But there was a detail about Charles's insurance policy that no one expected. It was not just a preparation for war, but it had unwittingly become a death warrant for himself and his father. To understand Teresa Lewis's psychology, we need to look deeper into her past. A past shaped by poverty, lack of education, and a chronic sense of insecurity. Dropping out of school early and a hasty marriage pushed her into a vicious cycle of dependency. After her divorce, she had no professional skills, struggled with manual labor jobs, and turned to alcohol and painkillers as an escape. Psychologists later diagnosed her with dependent personality disorder, a psychological condition that makes the patient feel helpless, unable to make their own decisions, and have an excessive need to be cared for by others. They often cling to relationships and are willing to do irrational things to avoid being abandoned. According to criminal psychologists, a person with a low IQ and diagnosed with dependent personality disorder, like Teresa, often seeks approval and is extremely susceptible to manipulation by individuals with stronger wills and higher intelligence. They are like a ship without a rudder, easily carried away by any strong enough wind. The appearance of Matthew Schallenberger, a 21-year-old with an IQ of 113, and Rodney Lamont Fuller, 19, was that toxic wind. Teresa met them at a Walmart and quickly entered into a 3-way love affair. For Teresa, this was probably not just about sex, but also about the attention, the validation of self-worth that she craved. Teresa's escalation to crime was alarming. Spring 2000, met Julian. Summer 2000, got married. December 2001, her husband's first stepson died her first exposure to a large insurance sum. August 2002, the second son bought insurance, and this time her name was on it. Fall 2002, met Schallenberger and Fuller young and reckless. October 2002, she gave them $200 to buy guns and laid out the murder plot. The slippery slope from a wife to a murder mastermind took place in just a few short months. There are 5 warning signs of manipulation in a relationship. 1. Excessive financial and emotional dependence. 2. Isolation from friends and family. 3. Unconditional seeking of approval. 4. Willingness to make decisions contrary to one's character and morals to please others. 5. An extreme sense of fear when not with that person. It seems Teresa Lewis exhibited all these signs in her relationship with Schallenberger. On the night of October 30, 2002, the air in the Lewis family's mobile home was thick with tension. From Teresa's perspective, it was the culmination of a plan she believed would set her free. She had left the back door unlocked, a silent invitation for death. While her two lovers snuck in, she waited in the kitchen, her heart probably pounding a mixture of fear and dark anticipation. After the gunshots rang out, she waited 45 minutes, an endlessly long and guilty period, before picking up the phone to call 911. During that time, as the husband she had once shared a bed with was taking his last breath, she coldly went through his wallet, taking his last dollars. From the perspective of Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, it was a paid job. They snuck into the house through the unlocked door. Schallenberger, considered the smarter and more decisive one, went to the bedroom where Julian was sleeping and fired multiple shots. Fuller, in the next room, used a shotgun to shoot Charles. When he found Charles was still alive, Fuller did not hesitate to fire 2 more shots to finish him off. Their actions were cold, ruthless, and efficient, like professional executioners. They received $300 from Teresa and disappeared into the night, believing they had completed the job perfectly. But there was one perspective they hadn't anticipated: the victims. Julian Lewis, in the final moments of his life, did not die instantly. When the sheriff's deputies burst in, he used his last bit of strength to utter the most damning accusation: "My wife knows who did this to me." That dying declaration tore apart Teresa's clumsy act of a home invasion. It became irrefutable evidence, the voice of the dead exposing the perpetrator. And finally, from the perspective of law enforcement, they arrived at a chaotic scene. A weeping woman, 2 bodies, and a deathbed accusation. The contradiction was too obvious. Teresa's story quickly fell apart. Let's pause the video for a moment. If you were the first investigator on the scene and heard Julian's dying words, what would you do next? Would you believe the wife's tears or the dying husband's words? The investigation that followed was swift. Julian's dying words were the trigger, but it was Teresa's subsequent actions that dug her own grave. Just days after the murders, before her husband and stepson were even buried, Teresa was caught trying to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's account with a forged check. Her insatiable greed exposed her true colors. Investigators didn't need the most complex forensic techniques. The biggest piece of evidence was Teresa's own haste and foolishness. Within a week of being detained, faced with irrefutable evidence, she confessed everything. She admitted to hiring Schallenberger and Fuller, giving them money for guns, and planning everything to get the $250 bond insurance money. The criminal network was quickly unraveled, leading to the arrest of her 2 accomplices. The chase in this case wasn't a high-speed pursuit, but a chase for the truth, and it ended quickly because of the mastermind's own mistakes. But the investigators didn't know that Teresa's confession, as clear as it seemed, hid a more complex truth about the roles and capabilities of each person in this deadly trio. The trial of Teresa Lewis became a dramatic stage play. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, painted a portrait of a cunning, heartless, and greedy woman. They argued that Teresa was the head of this snake, the mastermind who manipulated 2 young men to carry out her dark intentions. They emphasized her adulterous nature, her betrayal, and her callous behavior after the crime, rummaging through her husband's wallet as he lay dying. Their argument was simple regardless of her IQ. Her actions were those of a cold-blooded calculator. Because the case involved murder for hire, it qualified for the death penalty under Virginia law. The defense, facing a mountain of evidence and their client's own confession, chose a risky strategy. They advised Teresa to plead guilty, hoping that cooperation with the investigation and her remorse would lead the judge to grant leniency and impose a life sentence instead of death. They focused on 2 main points: Teresa's low IQ and her dependent personality disorder. Her lawyer, James E. Rocap III, argued, "She is not mentally retarded, but she is very, very close to it." They claimed that Teresa was not smart enough to devise such a complex plan on her own, but was merely a tool in the hands of Matthew Schallenberger, who had a much higher IQ. They presented to the court that Teresa was a dependent, easily influenced person who had been completely manipulated by Schallenberger. However, the judge was not convinced. He sided with the prosecution, declaring that Teresa was the mastermind, and sentenced her to death by lethal injection. Ironically, in separate trials, both Schallenberger and Fuller, the two who actually pulled the triggers, received only life sentences. This disparity in sentencing sparked a wave of outrage and controversy. Why did the actual killers escape the death penalty, while the supposed mastermind, a woman with limited intellectual capacity, had to face execution? Years after the verdict, a crucial detail emerged, casting doubt on the fairness of the sentence. In November 2004, a private investigator working for Teresa's legal team met with Matthew Schallenberger in prison. During the meeting, Schallenberger wrote a statement containing powerful words. "Teresa loved me. She was very eager to please me. She is also not that smart." This confession from the very man supposedly manipulated by Teresa painted a completely different picture, a picture of a smarter man who exploited the love and dependence of a not-that-smart woman. But then a strange act occurred. Schallenberger suddenly tore up and ate parts of the statement he had just signed, then said coldly, "What's done is done." What did this act mean? Was it remorse, or a final attempt to hide the truth and ensure Teresa bore the full blame? 2 years later, in 2006, Schallenberger committed suicide in prison, taking the final answer to his grave. His unfinished confession became a ghost, haunting the case, a question that would never be fully answered. Do you believe Schallenberger's unfinished confession? Was he telling the truth, or just trying to play one last psychological game? On September 22, 2010, 24 hours before the execution was to be carried out, the atmosphere at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women grew heavy. More than 7,300 clemency petitions had been sent to Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, a record number. Supporters, including anti-death penalty activists and renowned novelist John Grisham, argued that executing Teresa was a gross injustice. They pointed to her low IQ, the sentencing disparity with her two accomplices, and evidence suggesting Schallenberger was the true mastermind. They described Teresa as a model prisoner who had found remorse and often helped other inmates. But on September 17th, Governor McDonnell made his final decision, rejecting all appeals. He stated, "After careful consideration, I find no compelling reason to set aside the sentence." All final hopes were dashed. On the last evening of her life, Teresa Lewis was served her final meal. Her request was not for a lavish feast, but for simple dishes, reminiscent of a normal life she would never have again: 2 fried chicken breasts, sweet peas with butter, a Dr. Pepper, and for dessert apple pie. The meal was served in silence, a final ritual before facing death. It carried no meaning of defiance or symbolism, but was simply a humble request from a woman about to die. In the execution chamber at the Greensville Correctional Center, witnesses were present, including her stepdaughter, Kathy Lewis Clifton, the sister of victim Charles and daughter of victim Julian. When asked for her last words, Teresa did not speak of herself, did not plead, nor did she complain. She turned to Kathy and through the glass partition spoke the last words of her life. In a trembling but clear voice, she said, "I just want Kathy to know that I love you and I'm very sorry." Her use of the pronoun I and her direct apology to the victim's relative silenced the room. It was a confession of guilt, a plea for forgiveness, and also a farewell. These words did not deny responsibility, but directly confronted the pain she had caused. At 9:13 p.m., on September 23, 2010, the lethal injection process began. Teresa Lewis, the 41-year-old woman, was pronounced dead. The immediate reaction was one of deep division. The victim's family felt that justice had finally been served. The international media erupted in debates. With the death of Teresa Lewis, a tragic and controversial chapter in Virginia's judicial history closed, but the questions it raised still echo. After the execution, those involved in the case went their separate ways. Teresa's daughter, Christy Lynn Bean, who knew about the plot but did not report it, served a 5-year prison sentence and was later released, trying to rebuild her life in silence. Rodney Lamont Fuller, one of the 2 gunmen, is still serving a life sentence. The greatest legacy of the Teresa Lewis case is its profound impact on the legal system. It sparked a national debate on the application of the death penalty to women and people with limited intellectual capacity. Her case is often cited in discussions about sentencing fairness and the possibility of manipulation in cases with multiple defendants. 11 years after Teresa's death on March 24, 2021, the state of Virginia officially abolished the death penalty. This decision made Teresa Lewis the last woman to be executed in the state's history, a sad and haunting title. However, there are still unresolved elements. The biggest question remains unanswered. Who was the real mastermind? Did Teresa, with her IQ of 72, devise and direct a double murder plot on her own, or was she just a pawn manipulated by the more intelligent Matthew Schallenberger, who saw in her a perfect tool, a woman who loved him, depended on him, and was not smart enough to take all the blame? Schallenberger's death took the answer, with him leaving a permanent void in the truth of the case. If you or anyone has more information about the conversations or relationship between Teresa Lewis, Matthew Schallenberger, and Rodney Fuller before October 2002, that information could still help clarify this complex psychological picture, even though legal justice has been served.